Welcome to our panel. We're so pleased to welcome the Reverend Dr. Gregory Cuellar, who's an associate professor of Old Testament here at Austin Seminary. He's also an interdisciplinary and international biblical scholar. Prior to his current teaching position, he was the curator of rare books and manuscripts at the Colonial Mexican Imprint Collection at Cushing Memorial Library and Archives at Texas A&M. And at the juxtaposition of his interest in art and immigrant advocacy, he's also working on an art-based social action project called Art de Lágrimas, Refugee Artwork Project. And you can see that in our expo. You can see a link to an amazing virtual gallery of those works. We also are here to welcome again Reverend Jennifer Cumberbatch, who's ministered in the Central Texas region and beyond for over 30 years. A teacher, preacher, pastoral care specialist, author, and playwright, she uses her multiple gifts and assorted modalities to express the depth and breadth of God's unconditional love. And Dr. Kyrie O. Williams presently serves as the director of Austin Community College, their District for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center. Your name tag must be very, very large. Kyrie has amassed 14 years of professional experience shepherding diversity, equity, inclusion work, and advocacy for historically marginalized students at 4 institutions of higher education. We're so glad you all are with us today. Thank you. Now, for those of us who are watching, please feel free to drop any questions you have in the Q&A. Please don't put them in the chat. That'll be more difficult for me to find, so please put them in the Q&A. But I'm going to start off with a question. The theme of this year's conference is Remind, Restore, and Reimagine. And one of the ways we remind ourselves about who we are is through storytelling. Dr. Cuellar has helped children tell their stories through art. Reverend Cumberbatch preaches, writes, and acts. Reverend Miller, who couldn't be here today, has spent time collecting the stories of others. And I'm sure Dr. Williams has heard thousands of stories over the course of his work. Could you reflect on the role of storytelling and the narrative in your work?
Absolutely. I would say at the at ACC, via the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center, our role is to cultivate an intentional space where we can learn through storytelling. So it's one thing to say that, I'm a director at ACC and I love higher education. I work with students, but there's another thing to share my story as a man of color in our society and some of the negative experiences I've had. So I think we get to a better understanding around justice and equity through having opportunities to be courageous and sharing our stories. We get to understanding what helps us and what makes us unique. But we also get to what we have in common versus often the surface level conversations we have in passing as colleagues every day. The hi, the bye, the how was your weekend. We get to a deeper understanding of what the issues and concerns are and what we have in common. We're able to have a conversation about some of these experiences we have that shape who we are.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a right brain person, so it dominates over my aesthetics, and my creativity sometimes dominate over language, logic, and a timestamp. And so it's just a part of how I'm made to understand how telling our stories, both our individual narrative and our group narrative, ethnocentric, related to culture, etc. It's I love this quote. I used it in the workshop by Toni Morrison. She says, "Create a story, and you realize that it's creating you as you create it." And so as a counselor, I understand that we all have a biographical story. We all recite that story to ourselves, and we all recite it either through symbol, meaning art, or actual conversation to others. And so I'm enamored with how our experiences and our relationships actually cause us to be whole-brained, relating the logic side to the emotional side. And so when we're telling our stories, it's a shortcut to empathy, because our brain literally uses those mirror neurons to link up with the person that's telling the story. And if we allow people to be felt and heard in the narration of their stories, then we can find ourselves linking up with them and feeling empathy and entering their story. And that's particularly important during a time of trauma or stress or a feeling of being threatened. To have your story and the feelings underneath your story heard and felt is healing. It's restorative.
Yeah, and for me, I grew up hearing stories from my grandparents about the early histories of Texas, and those stories were starkly different from what I was being taught in school, and how those stories lamented the loss of property, the loss of dignity, the loss of access to social mobility. And that grief and lament being a part of storytelling stuck with me since an early age. And when I came to study the Bible, and you read books like the Lamentations and the prophetic literature that laments the loss of destroyed Jerusalem and going into exile, I was able to connect with those stories, not just from an academic standpoint, but from a personal standpoint. And then the power of how story is told, right? Whether it be in narrative or in poetry, that those forms of telling the story is an art form. And that could be a way of coping with the grief and the lament. And all of those experiences and my own training are brought to bear in my activist project, where I'm engaged with asylum seekers who are telling their stories about their journeys, their homes, through art. And I'm not a professional counselor. I'm not a therapist, but seeing some of the children draw, their homes or their pets, I could see immediately just this spark, and they go into those worlds in a very, I think, positive way. And so it's what we're talking about, the power of art as therapy. I can attest to that personally and intellectually.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you all so much for those really thoughtful answers. So we've talked about the role of the individual story and therapy and connecting, and what are the sort of national stories or Texas level stories or international stories that you think need to be retold, that maybe are made more complex, that we're hearing now? If you could choose a story that we tell ourselves as a culture, that you could retell, what would it be?
Well, I'd like to begin with how you linked our stories, our biographical stories, and our group stories, and our nation stories, and how you related that to the divine narrative. I think that's so powerful to see ourselves in the context of the great narrative of redemption that's told in the biblical context, to be able to see ourselves as every tribe and every nation, and the uniqueness of every tribe and every nation in the context of the redemptive story of repairing the earth back to good. And I would like to see each one of our biographical stories, as well as our group stories, linked to that divine story. And it never gets old telling it over and over and over again.
I would say I think from my perspective, there's a kind of a belief that if we are good Christians, we don't make mistakes as it relates to stereotypes and biases. And I think I think that's false. I think that the reality is that we, as human beings, we are all impacted by stereotypes. We're all impacted by biases, and if we aren't aware of it, we allow it to impact our actions and how we engage with people that are different from us. So I think I would want us to understand that, you know, however well-meaning we think we may be, if we're not doing the work of becoming more equitable and just as leaders, and also and not doing the work in our institutions, then we're going to make mistakes, and it's going to have a disparate impact on somebody. So I think the story needs to be retold. Is that we need to do the work, regardless of how just we feel we are. There's always more work to be done. There's always more growth that can happen within us as individuals and within our organizations. So we shouldn't think of that as that's the work for people that aren't as good off as we are, or because we are good people, we feel like we're doing it well. We're probably making some mistakes.
Well, I would say that one story that I've been retold and told again, it has to do with the story about the border. Growing up near the border in South Texas, I grew up with a story that told me I didn't cross the border crossed me. And so I was always attuned to what was happening and what is happening at the border. And what you're starting to see is the narrative now with what's going on in the West, in the Ukraine. We're seeing a broader story about refugees and about migration. That's a story that goes back to the early history of humankind, the need to move for the sake of survival. That's natural to our instinct. But the story we're told in modern time is that migration is a problem, and that it needs to be solved, and that it's criminal to migrate for the sake of survival. We also have a racial logic that blinds how we see refugees and how we see migrants, and I think it's becoming more and more apparent even today, where you have groups of Europeans, Eastern Europeans, who are rightly needing to seek refuge in Poland, but how they're quickly portrayed as refugees, whereas you have people coming from the Northern Triangle who are also trying to leave violence. And it may not be the violence of war, but it's economic violence, social violence, ideological violence. And that they're immediately portrayed as criminals, that they're the ones who are pouring over our borders to infiltrate our society with drugs and criminality. And those narratives, I think we need to re-examine, and we need to offer a counter narrative that helps people put them in the right, those stories in the right perspective.
And I think that goes back to, just the way the brain works when we think more highly of ourselves than we ought. When we don't understand that we have all been created from one blood, but have been specifically assigned times and seasons and culture and language so that it reflects the complete image of God in the earth. And when we can understand that and put our stories in that context, literally the brain is scanning the environment to detect danger. And when we think more highly of ourselves than we ought, and we don't think of ourselves in connection with God and our neighbor, and loving ourselves as we love our neighbor, we get false alarms go off in our brain, and we portray danger, and we're always in fight, flight, or freeze mode. And it is, I believe that, and I believe I'm in like company, that it's the narrative of the Bible that says that we all are made in the image of God, and that we're to respect that image, and that God is not fully portrayed in the earth if every part of our reflection of God's image is not imparted in the earth. It calms the amygdala down and doesn't consider other as threat, but considers other as a part of the divine narrative. So I couldn't agree with both of you more, that those stories need to be told in the context of relationship that is engendered by our respect for the divine in each one of us. And in our workshop, I didn't get a chance to do it, but there's a exercise from imago therapy that is used when couples are having a disconnect, and it's called couples dialogue. And what it does is you choose, I was encouraging everyone to choose another human being, possibly a person that has a different group narrative or an individual narrative. And the first part of it is called mirroring, where you just reflect back to the person what you think you heard them say in their narrative. And then once they've completed that, the next step is validation. And you don't have to agree with somebody to validate their perspective. And then the next part is hearing the feelings, the emotions underneath that narrative. That must have made you feel. And then you switch places. And I think it's an incredible tool to use to hear the emotion and the to be seen and felt in the midst of your narrative. And it has a possibility of building relationships where we feel safe and known instead of stereotyped or mislabeled as human.
That's a wonderful tool. Thank you. We have a question from Crystal in the chat or in the Q&A. What are some actions we can do in our ministry settings? Should we suggest to our members of creating a ministry that travel to the border?
Well, I think that borders are not just the international border that we have 2.5 hours south of Austin, and I'm thinking of Eagle Pass. That's important, but there are borders being developed where you are as a student. And I think Reverend Cumberbatch referred to the divine narrative as an important story that we need to tell those around us, and how we see ourselves in the story of Scripture, where God does designate human beings and all of creation as intrinsically important and the good as part of what is good. But that form of reading isn't necessarily encouraged by the academy. And so there are borders that exist within disciplines. You just being able to engage a womanist interpreter or a Asian American or queer hermeneutic, that's a border that you're crossing. That's an activist move where you're allowing for another perspective, one that is going to open the scriptures up to a different way of thinking that could lead to more of a healing world for you. So it's not just going to the immediate border, because that border that we find south of us is the archive of multiple borderings that are going on in our society. It's just a reification of what we do on a daily basis where we live. And so you could start where you are and how you're studying, to be able to take the scriptures and see them beyond just the academic realm and the intellectual benefit, but how can they meet the needs of people around you? How can they speak life? So I think that's an important part where you could start with the idea of action, where you're at.
Absolutely. I would agree with that 100%. I think often there's a desire to heal the broader community, to heal the world, and that absolutely is part of our charge as Christians. But often we haven't taken a pause to really look at our own organization. What are the equity and justice concerns that live within our organization, that permeate every day? What have we heard the voices of others that are underrepresented within our organizations, and heard how they feel about their experience, and what can we do to make us stronger within our own organization before we look outside? That often, and I think about kind of the concept of professional development, and I think in our professional roles, it makes sense but I don't think that often congregations look at it as something that's important to them. And I didn't even, it wasn't even something that resonated with me until I was actually asked to kind of spend a few hours with some church leaders. And I think that's so important that we are having these conversations as leadership within our ministries before we try to go outside and heal.
That is doing the work.
Mhm.
That is doing the work. It resonates from the commandment on which lays all the law and the prophets. It's not dealing with legalistic, moralistic ways of dealing with the scripture. It is dealing with actually, if you look at the definition of love, right? It is literally embodying love as a good work to repair the earth and to tear down the borders that my brother spoke of. Yeah, that's doing the work. We are recreated in Christ Jesus to do good works, and on an individual level, on a relationship by relationship. And it not only repairs the earth, it repairs our brain, it repairs our thinking, it repairs how we show up as human.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How can we heal the world when there are folks right in our congregation that are hurting?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I heard a tragic story, but an experience nevertheless, where there was a congregation where the pastor was of European descent, and most of the congregation was of European descent. And they had a young lady who was African American descent. And she, out of the tradition or common practice among Black folk, she went to her pastor to seek solace when Trayvon Martin was killed. And because there had been no work done, he was totally baffled by why she would even come to him to ask him for solace or to hear her story or see how she felt or was positioning herself in that story. And his response was woefully lacking, because it was like, well, why are you coming to me? I didn't shoot the bullets. I didn't, I'm not a racist. And it was defensive instead of literally being able to hear her narrative and hear her pain underneath that. And I think we as pastors and as educators and as people who are leading other people and influencing other people, we can choose our dyads, our places of conversation, and get to break down those borders one-on-one, and it will have a ripple effect when I'm enamored. Have you ever read the book Blacks and Jews by Cornel West and Michael Lerner? This was my model. Have you heard of it, Doctor?
I have.
Oh my gosh. I read it like back in the 90s, which is in the olden days. And they purposely, Cornel West as a Christian and Michael Lerner as a Jew, for 3 years, they were purposeful about being at each other's baptisms, bar mitzvahs, breaking bread together, talking about their children, talking about their differences in faith. And they were intentional about building that relationship and knowing each other as human and not as other, even though there were differences that they respected. And it had a ripple effect.
Yeah, I Reverend Cumberbatch is referring to books, and that does remind me that for me, when I think of trauma in U.S. society, I start with the African American experience. That's just where I begin, and I'm drawn to that experience, and I try to understand as a Latino. When I'm trying to contextualize trauma in the region, we have to think about the pandemic trauma that has happened with other populations in other communities. And for me, one entry point into a broader conversation about shared trauma is when I read books like Saidiya Hartman's book on starting with slavery and understanding the nature of slavery, understanding what the generational trauma that has created, the economical impact that has had on African American communities. And then it leads me to the Black church and how it has served as a place to forge civic skills and leadership and public engagement. So it's being able to move beyond just the trauma of your own context and find, not that any one trauma is better than the other. It's how can we share with each other our grievances and find ways where we can collaborate and we can create a coalition where the narrative even becomes much stronger when it's
Absolutely.
seen as shared.
That's the reimagining part of HESED. That I can imagine myself in your story.
It's beautiful. And Marta asks a sort of a practical question about all of this. How do we bring narrative storytelling into our churches other than the expected from the pulpit to encourage empathy building?
I think so. As I think about, I'm a member at Greater Mount Zion, and I think about my past congregation. One of the things I've appreciated is sometimes our congregations can be so large that it's so big that it's hard to have that connection. So the use of circles or smaller kind of tribes to kind of build those connections can be very powerful, and I think a lot of storytelling can happen there. So sometimes it's hard to have it beyond occasional sermons. Sometimes it's hard to have it in the larger experience. But those smaller spaces, if you have skilled facilitators and some preparation around that, it can be a powerful mechanism.
And I think bringing art into the pulpit, bringing monologues that tell people's story. One of the innovative things that we did at the Neil Cochran House, which is a house built ostensibly by the same master builder that built the governor's mansion, and it's almost a replica, except it's on a smaller scale, is, we brought in a character that was the shoeshine man that literally told the story of the 5 slaves that were sold to finance the construction of the house, and the artisans, and presented, like you were saying, presented a different narrative than is the historic narrative, that it doesn't begin only with slavery and trauma. It begins with contributions and resilience and well-being, and how all of us in our differences have created you were talking about a national narrative. When we begin to respect the contributions and along with the traumas as a whole that we've made to our nation, to our world. And I think that that's very doable by inviting people to creatively express their stories from the quote unquote pulpit.
Yeah, and creative activism is one mode for mobilizing and encouraging and inspiring social action. But there also is, still that need for a prophetic voice that directly speaks to power. And so the pulpit can utilize different modes. I don't want to privilege one over the other. There is the need, and I've done this with the art project that we have, where we bring art to congregations so that they can see a different story about migration and how that just marinates with them, and many are moved to sympathy and even empathy. But then there's also the pastors involved speaking directly about the problem, the economic issues. This is the prophetic voice that we see in Micah, we see in Jeremiah and Isaiah. They're not just talking about evil vaguely. They're naming it in all of its structural issues. And so moving into that prophetic role of naming the problem directly and being able to provide a solution and motivating the congregation is also enormously important and can accompany creative activism
Right.
in very strong ways.
Right. It's a both and, not an either or.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I also believe the part of the church's mission is to be in the community. So there's tons of opportunities to hear these narratives through opportunities. I mean, through platforms like the Neil Cochran House or ACC, or I'm sure there's tons of others where, I mean, it takes a little bit of work, but taking the congregation outside of the church into the community to take advantage of some of these resources to hear some of these different narratives.
That just blesses me so much because that jives with my definition of the church. We are in the world.
Absolutely.
And we like Christ are servants.
Mm-hmm.
And the church is not a building. The church is, I know how we deal with language, but it's not my church and your church and the Black church and the Latino church. It's the church, the body of Christ in the world, healing the world, reconciling the world. So yeah, we should go outside our four walls. And that's being the church. That's doing the work.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we should probably spend more time outside the walls than we do inside the walls. Being the church.
But what about the weeks of meetings about the carpet? Where are we going to have those? Speaking of leaving the church, Kali Fernandez asks Dr. Cuellar if there are any current plans for the seminary students to visit the border to serve and learn.
Well, thank you, Kali, for that question. And Kali Fernandez, she's the director of Puentes de Cristo there near McAllen. She's doing some great work with the immigrant populations there, undocumented asylum seekers. So thank you for that question. And I think for us to be in the border, it's always been my hope that the seminary doesn't just look to the north in order to make connections, but that we also look to the south. And in fact, the south goes from Austin all the way to the tip of Argentina. And we want to be able to involve we want our educational vision to be broad, but to also be local. And so going to the border is an easy thing. Kali, that's something I've always tried to encourage, and I will continue to do that, either informally or formally. And we have plans already to a few trips for the summer. So we'll be seeing you very soon. Keep the water cold over there for us.
Yeah, we've been sort of constrained as a seminary for the last 2 years. And so we're excited to start dreaming about travel again.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of the last 2 years, and the second sort of part of our theme, Restore, from your particular lens on the world, what's something we've lost as a society the last couple of years that you would like to see either restored or transformed?
Can I enter that question from another angle?
Any angle you'd like. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I gained from quote unquote the pandemic, which contributed to post-traumatic growth on my part, is I learned the art of Sabbat. I learned the art that the earth even has to rest. I learned that from a funny perspective, it's a commandment, not a suggestion. And how our brains, our bodies, the land repairs itself when we allow ourselves to rest. So I'm entering it from another perspective and saying that's something I would like to take as post-traumatic growth from the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that this pandemic certainly inspired me to take up the Mexican tradition of siesta. Uh, uh, but there's also, you know, and this is something that I've learned from my studies of incarcerated people, and how a carceral environment, an environment of isolation and solitude, can inadvertently affect your social skills, and that you have the trust element and feelings of safety
Absolutely.
can also be affected severely when you are in an isolated element, an isolated environment. And so some of the detainees that I've been fortunate to visit and to encounter, the coming out of detention and learning how to relate to people again, learning to trust people again. And I think that this is something we're seeing at a different level. There's already a level of mistrust in our society. I think it's built into our society in due to the economics that we follow. But this pandemic, I think, has intensified the mistrust that we have when we're with each other.
I agree with you.
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just
I'm
saying
back.
amen.
Oh, yes, ma'am. I was just, as being in the educational space, and also even reflecting on my experience in my congregation, in terms of in-person participation, it's down. I mean, it needs to be for us to be safe, and I understand that. But I think from that, what something that's resonating with me is that everyone isn't okay. It's not for some folks. Isolation can be truly it can be pretty harmful. So I think as leaders in our congregations, we have to figure out a better way to make sure we are checking in on folks if they can't be in our physical spaces, to make sure that they're all right, to make sure that they're feeling connected, and make sure that they are getting what they need mentally, physically, and spiritually to be okay. Because I feel like a lot of folks aren't okay, and I see that in our students on a weekly basis.
I see that in my practice. There's a disintegration of reality, and it becomes stressful just to exist in isolation because we are built to be social beings.
Yeah.
I had an experience. We lived in a predominantly white neighborhood. Well, yeah, anyway. So where I was out for a walk or out for a run, and a woman crossed over to this is pre-pandemic. She crossed over to the other side of the street when she saw me walking toward her in this neighborhood. And that experience has been amplified since the pandemic. And so, yeah, I agree with you that we are going to have to learn, practice trusting one another. The fear and the danger and the threat of a virus have also amplified our fear of different. I was reading something that 3/4 of the neurons in our brain are looking for danger. It's just scanning the atmosphere, the context, looking for danger. And if we're not careful, we will stereotype and create constructs that signify danger where it doesn't exist. That's, stereotyping in one way is the brain trying to figure out what things will threaten my existence. And so I agree with you wholeheartedly that we have to continue to do the work of breaking down the borders so that in addition to the pandemic, we don't see each other as dangerous or as threat.
So after the winter storm, this is not a question, I'm just reflecting now, but after the winter storm last year, I started getting a little ordered some solar lanterns and got some hand work, I have a little bug out bag now. But as I was doing research for that, I realized Pottery Barn sold a leather and canvas emergency kit for $495 with 3 days of, so even in our capitalism is reacting to this fear and this vulnerability that we fill. So even rich people can have really gorgeous emergency kits that'll last them for 3 days. But it just kind of blew my mind.
Absolutely. And if we're not community, we will hoard.
Mhm.
We will not participate in an economy of plenty.
Mhm.
We will hoard our affection. We will hoard our attention. We will hunker down in little groups that feel safe. And we won't come out of our self-defined place of safety to make sure that other people have and are safe and are related to, and their mental health is taken care of. That's the mandate of the church. We can't afford to just hoard things to ourselves. We've seen the miracle, the transformation of what is it? 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So we have to make sure that we don't buy into that psychology.
Yeah, that's an important part of what you were talking about, the need to leave the 4 walls of the church. How important travel is to learning how to trust others. Learning how to trust others is being able to see life where they're at, what's going on in their lives, what actually they're having to endure on a daily life, on a routine basis, and being able to see that physically, mentally, spiritually, being able to see and experience that moves us closer to being able to trust each other. But if we continue to be isolated and live in quarantine, we quarantine ourselves. We're quarantining also our social skills.
Absolutely.
We breaking out. One way to break out is to make that trip. Yes, Kali, make that trip to the border, or go to where you are in your local community, so that you can engage in public issues. So that's an important part. Travel is an important part. Being able to get out.
And that doesn't mean on an airplane, or necessarily on an airplane, or on a mode of transportation. Move yourself out of your bunker. That's travel. That's movement. And it reconnects the brain to the body.
Leave your house. Alona Street Stewart, in her keynote address, talked about creating sacred space for herself, surrounding herself with art, with books, with photographs that are meaningful for her, to help sustain her and remind her of the stories from that are important to her and her work. So how do you, as leaders, how do you create a sense of safety, a sense of the sacred, to motivate you and to give you energy for the work that you do?
For me, I try to create a sense of safety by just being transparent, but being vulnerable myself. Even though I've been doing equity work for nearly 15 years, I often reflect on mistakes I've made, missteps I've made as a professional, to hopefully help show that it's not. It's a human being thing. We all do it. The work is being able to acknowledge when we do it, being able to spot it when we do it, and correct it. That's whether it's an individual action or a policy or practice that's built into our organizations. It's okay that we're making mistakes, but we have to be able to grow from them and be able to be honest about them as leaders.
And Doctor, how do you love yourself? How do you have somebody that's breathing life back into you?
I think so. I have an amazing wife, an amazing family, and I'm blessed to literally do what I'm passionate about, and I feel like I'm purposed to do. So that's what breathes life into me. I wake up excited to do this work every day because I feel like I'm doing exactly what God has for me.
Yeah, I perform a ritual every time I come to either writing or I'm preparing for classes. I'm just going to step over and get this object here. So this is an object that I made here out of dry clay, and what I do is it's surrounded by foliage and a vine, and I fill it up with oil that my mother gave me, and I make sure that each morning that before I begin my work, that I anoint my temples here, asking God to anoint my mind, and then I ask God to anoint my eyes that I may be able to see what God sees. Anoint my lips that I may be able to speak truth to power, but also be a voice for the voiceless. I anoint my heart and my hands, and that helps me ground myself. So that it's a ritual that is rooted in curanderismo. This is a spiritualist practice in South Texas that actually has roots in Native American religion. And so this is a practice of having incense, candles lit also in remembrance of those who have died because of unjust power and who have been oppressed, and just making that ritual and those symbols present before I enter a space of writing or thinking or teaching.
So I take advantage of, I don't know if you all can hear all that background noise. Okay, so
Yes.
We can, but we can hear you very clearly.
okay.
Yes.
So that space between being fully awake and still like coming out of REM sleep, I literally just I've discovered that prayer for me is more listening than speaking, and so I developed that practice when my kids were younger because it was before their little feet hit the floor. And so I've developed that as a ritual to just lay there and make myself available to hear from the divine, to hear my own heartbeat, to feel my breath. And then also walking does it for me, just being outside and also taking the Lord's Supper has taken a new, powerful, restorative place in my during the pandemic, and hopefully beyond.
Thank you all so much for beautiful answers. So thinking about the work you do every day, this is an imagination question, if you had all the time and all the money in the world, what's something you would want to do?
This doesn't, there are no wrong answers here, right? Okay. I would like to have a farm and raise produce and share with my neighbors and build a huge table and cook and invite neighbors and exchange recipes and exchange food and drink. And yeah, if I had all the money in the world, I would do that. So anybody that's out there listening.
That's beautiful. And one of our students, Katie Lamoureux, who was here earlier, I don't think she's here now, but a few years ago, she and her husband did that, not to the scale, it's a small farm. They've got a few animals, some rescue, 2 of her alpacas just died actually, but she just wanted this sort of that life. And I sort of live vicariously through her photos without having to do any of the hard work that is actually involved. Thank you. What about you, Dr. Quay or Dr. Williams?
In the in my space, in the educational space, one of the things that I'm always a part of in terms of our conversations is around our graduation retention of our most underserved, underrepresented populations. So if I had all the money in the world, then I'd do everything I could for there to impact there not being any disparities. Like, not to say we're not going to lose some students. Not to say there's not going to be some students who won't graduate. But there shouldn't be a disparity. There shouldn't be 10 points, 15 points, 20-point difference in a racial and ethnic group. So investing everything I could in kind of turning that around.
Yeah, I would probably employ a large workforce to begin dismantling the border wall, and use that as a symbol that they're gainfully employed and have a wage that is livable, and that symbol of bringing down the walls will reverberate to the rest of our society. That walls do not work. Bridges work. Bridges move us, bring us together. And so I think that's an investment that I would make. I would also, as a personal, just to be able to create a gallery space for the children's art that people can come and see it physically.
I love that, getting paid to pull down the wall.
It's good.
It gives new meaning to WPA.
Love it. Well, thank you all so much. We just have a few minutes left before worship. Is there anything that you would like to say or ask each other before we wrap up?
Thank you very much for all of your work, Sarah, and also to the organizers. This is, I think, a miracle that this HESED lecture has been on for 8 years, all student-led by the students of color. So I just want to congratulate them and express my appreciation to their work and your work.
Thank you so much. The students are incredible. And Usama Malik, related to our office, he took the lead this year with HESED from our office, and he's just done a really terrific job. So anything that looks good that I've done is really because he has done it. The best. Well, thank you all. So this has been so life-giving. What a conversation. I'm leaving inspired and energized. I'm really grateful to get to know you, Reverend Cumberbatch and Dr. Williams, and hope that this won't be the last we get to engage with each other. And thank you again, Dr. Cuellar, for bringing your just love and passion to this project. Appreciate it. And we'll see you all in worship at 2:00 on the main stage. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Our honor, our delight.